Welcome to Lens of History. This channel exists for one reason: the stories that didn't survive, the people who were never meant to be remembered, and who deserve to be. If that's the kind of history you're here for, subscribe. You're in the right place. And leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every one. Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, March 1865. The master woke to the sound of fire. Not nearby, not the immediate close roar of something burning within reach, but the low, orange-lit sound of multiple fires burning simultaneously across a wide area. The kind of sound that meant this was not an accident. The kind of sound that meant someone had decided. He sat up in his bed. The room was dark except for the light coming through the tall windows. Not moonlight, which was cold and blue, but the warmer, unsteady light of things burning on the grounds below. He could hear shouting. He could hear horses beyond the window in a state of panic that went beyond surprise. The specific, high register of animals that have smelled smoke and lost all faith in the people responsible for them. He could hear, beneath everything else, the flat, percussive sound of gunfire. Not a single shot. Not a warning, the sustained, deliberate sound of a fight that had started without him. He reached for the pistol on the nightstand. His hand found the nightstand. The pistol was not there. He sat in the dark and understood, in the particular way a man understands things when there is no longer time to not understand them, that the night had been organized. That everything outside his windows, the fires, the horses, the gunshots, the shouting rising and falling across the grounds, was not chaos. It was a plan reaching its conclusion. He became aware then that he was not alone in the room. He turned. They stood in a line along the far wall. Not two, not three. Not the five he had known, whose faces he had memorized, whose names appeared in his ledger in his overseer's careful handwriting, whose hours in the fields he had recorded and valued and planned around for nearly 2 decades. 10. 10 faces lit by the firelight coming through the windows, looking at him across the room with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a very long time for this exact moment and have now arrived at it without hurry. He opened his mouth. The one nearest the door, the oldest, the one he had always known by her ledger name, the one he had believed he understood, took one step forward. "You don't know us," she said. Her voice was quiet, level, the voice of someone who has decided what she is going to say and has no interest in being interrupted. "You never did." He died before he understood what she meant. He died not knowing the thing that had been living inside his own property for 19 years. He died not knowing about Cora. Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, 19 years earlier. The midwife came at midnight. Her name was Della, and she had been delivering children on the Pruitt plantation and the 3 properties surrounding it for 22 years. This meant she had seen most of what birth could do. The easy ones that came like answers to questions, and the terrible ones that came like questions with no answers, and the ones that fell somewhere in between, which was most of them. She moved through the plantation at night with the authority of someone whose work was too important to be governed by the usual rules, and the men she passed on her way to the birthing cabin had learned, over 22 years, not to stop her. She pushed open the door. She set down her bag. She looked at the woman on the pallet. The woman's name was Cora. She was 23 years old, and she had come to the Pruitt plantation 4 years ago from a property in Mississippi whose records had not survived the transaction. Sold twice in 3 years, separated from a mother she did not speak about. She was not large, and she was not small. She had the kind of face that people looked past rather than at. Not plain, but careful, arranged. The face of someone who had understood, young, that being noticed was a form of risk. She was in labor. Della examined her. She put her hands on the woman's abdomen and held them there for a long moment and felt, beneath her palms, what she had felt only twice before in 22 years of this work. The specific, unmistakable arrangement of two sets of bones where one was expected. Twins. She looked at Cora. Cora looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. In the silence between them, an understanding passed. Not negotiated, not discussed, not fully conscious on either side. Just recognized. The way two people recognize something simultaneously when both of them already know what it means and what it costs. Della had delivered twins before. She knew what happened to them. She knew what the ledger said and what the arithmetic said. Two assets where one was expected. A windfall for a man who thought in terms of windfalls. She knew what happened when twin children were discovered. Separated early, sold separately, because two identical assets on a single property represented redundancy in the eyes of men who ran their properties like arithmetic problems. She had seen it happen. She had watched a mother's face the day after and carried that face in her memory for 11 years. She did not intend to let it happen tonight. "Breathe," she said to Cora, "and be quiet." The first child came at midnight, a girl. Small, dark, screaming for approximately 4 seconds before Della's practiced hand covered her mouth, gently, the way you cover something precious, and brought her down to a sound that would not carry through the cabin walls. "Let me see her," Cora said. Not a request, a statement of what was going to happen. Della held the child where she could see her. Cora looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman seeing something she had refused to expect. Not joy, which was too large and too exposed for a moment this dangerous, but something that lived just beneath joy. Something quieter, more permanent. "Hannah," Cora said, without hesitation. The second child came 40 minutes later, also a girl, identical in the way that twins are identical, not like copies, but like the same sentence spoken twice with the same meaning and slightly different weight. "Ruth," said Cora. Della wrapped Ruth in the second cloth she had brought. She looked at the two children, one in each arm, and made the decision she had been moving toward since the moment her hands first told her the truth of what was happening. The decision that would become the architecture of everything that followed. "Listen to me," she said. "On this plantation, you had one child tonight, one girl, Hannah. She lives here in your cabin. Everyone knows her." She paused. "Ruth goes to my sister's property, 12 miles east. She will know who she is. She will know you. She will know everything. But she will not be here." Cora looked at her. "You will see her," Della said. "Not often, not openly, but you will see her. I give you my word on that." The fire in the small grate burned low between them. "Why?" said Cora. Della looked at her with the expression of a woman who has had 22 years to form an answer to a question like this one. "Because one child they can account for," she said. "Two they can separate. One you can protect. Two they can use against each other and against you." She let that settle. "And if there are more?" said Cora. It was the way she said it. Not as a question, not as a possibility, but as something being calmly acknowledged, that made Della go still. Cora looked back at her with the careful, contained expression that was her face's natural position, the face that gave nothing unless she chose to give it. "My mother," she said, "and her mother, and hers before that." She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The second pregnancy came in the spring of 1849, By then, Hannah was 2 years old and had become part of the background of the Pruitt plantation in the way that small children become background, present in every outdoor scene, occasionally acknowledged, not the subject of close attention. Gerald Pruitt knew she existed the way he knew all the children on his property, as future labor, as entries that would mature in a decade. He did not pay close attention to the size of Cora's abdomen until it was very large. By then, Della had already arranged everything. The second twins were boys, Samuel and Eli. Samuel stayed. Eli went to a freedman's farm in the next parish. A man named Tomas, who had owed Della a specific debt for 6 years and had been waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that debts like that were collected at the creditor's timing, to pay it. The third pregnancy came in 1851. 2 boys, Isaac and Daniel. Isaac stayed. Daniel went to a woman named Pauline in the hill country, a free woman who took him in without being told more than she needed to know, and who raised him with the same quiet ferocity she brought to everything in her life. The fourth pregnancy came in 1854. 2 girls, Grace and Miriam. Miriam was the one Cora asked Della about 3 days after the birth, when she was well enough to ask things directly. "Where will she go?" "A family in Rapides Parish," Della said. "Good people. They have 2 daughters already. She'll have sisters." Cora looked at her. "She has sisters," she said. Della held her gaze. "She'll have those too," she said. Cora said nothing for a moment. She looked at the window, the small, high window of the birthing cabin showing a strip of gray November sky. "Does she look like Grace?" she said finally. "Exactly," said Della. "Then they'll find each other." It was not a question. It was the specific certainty of a woman who has built something and trusts what she has built. The fifth pregnancy came in 1857, a boy and a girl, Thomas and Esther. Thomas stayed. Esther went. 5 pregnancies, 10 children, 5 visible on the Pruitt plantation: Hannah, Samuel, Isaac, Grace, Thomas, and 5 distributed through the parishes around it, growing up in the households of people who owed Della debts or who understood, without being told the full shape of it, what was being constructed. Gerald Pruitt's ledger recorded 5 children born to Cora over 14 years. He noted it with the satisfaction of a man whose investments were performing, a healthy woman delivering reliably, adding to his inventory at a reasonable rate. He had no idea what was actually being built on his property. Nobody told him. Not because anyone had organized the silence, though Della had made certain things clear to certain people in her quiet, final way, but because the silence was natural. Because people who live under total surveillance develop over generations the specific capacity to not say out loud what doesn't need to be said out loud. The people in the quarters who knew or suspected or had seen something and understood what it meant, they filed it in the place where everything true and dangerous lived. They kept it. They kept it for 19 years. Ruth came back for the first time in the winter of 1852. She was 5 years old, and she came with Della's sister on a Sunday afternoon in December, the one afternoon of the week when movement between properties was permitted and supervised, and therefore, paradoxically, the easiest time to move freely, because supervised movement looks exactly like permitted movement. Cora saw her from across the yard. She did not run. She did not call out. She walked toward her daughter at the pace of a woman crossing a yard for an ordinary reason, and she stopped in front of her, and she looked at her face, this face that was Hannah's face, that was her face, that had been growing in a house 12 miles east for 5 years without her. And she felt something that had no clean name, something that was grief and relief and love and the particular ache of a thing that has been held at arm's length for so long that contact, when it finally comes, is almost painful. Ruth looked up at her. She had her mother's eyes. She had the careful, watchful quality, already at 5, of someone who understood that the world required attention. "I know who you are," Ruth said. "I know you do," said Cora. "Della's sister told me everything." "Good." Ruth looked at her for another moment. "Hannah knows about me," she said, not a question. "Yes." "Does she want to meet me?" "She's wanted to meet you since the day you were born," said Cora. Ruth nodded once, with the specific settling quality of someone who has been waiting for an answer to a question they've been carrying for a long time. They stood together in the December yard for 20 minutes. It was the longest 20 minutes of Cora's life, and the shortest, and she thought about it for years afterward. The particular quality of that afternoon light, flat and cool, and her daughter's 5-year-old hand in hers, and the sound of the plantation going about its Sunday business around them, entirely unaware of what was standing in its yard. She saw Ruth 4 more times over the following decade, each time briefly, each time arranged through Della's network with the careful planning of a thing that could not afford to look like what it was. Each time, the girl she saw was more her daughter and less a stranger, which was not the same as knowing her, which was never the same as knowing her, but which was, she had decided, enough. Enough to hold, enough to build on. Cora raised 5 children in plain sight. This was its own kind of work, not the hidden work, not the planning, but the daily, visible labor of being a mother inside a system that did not recognize her children as hers. Feeding them when the rations ran short, watching them walk into the fields as soon as their backs were strong enough for it, and keeping her face arranged into the expression that the situation required, which was no expression at all. She taught them to read, not openly, in the spaces, in the margins of hours, in the 30 minutes before the morning bell and the 40 minutes after the light failed, in the marks she scratched in the dirt floor of the cabin with a pointed stick, covered immediately with her foot when footsteps approached outside, in the system of notation she had built over years from fragments of language collected the way a person collects everything when collection is the only accumulation available. By the time Hannah was 12, she could read a full page and write a clear, precise sentence. By the time Samuel was 10, the same. Each of the 5 visible children learned what their mother taught, and each of them carried it, through Della's network and through the carefully arranged meetings, to the 5 who were hidden. 10 children who could read, in a parish where enslaved people reading was illegal. This was not the plan. The literacy was simply what Cora believed her children were owed. She had believed it about herself once, before the world made clear what it thought she was owed, and she had decided to keep believing it anyway, and to pass the belief along to the only people she could pass it to. The plan came later. The plan came when the children were old enough to make plans themselves. It began with Hannah. She was 19 when she came to her mother on a November evening in 1856 and sat down across from her at the small table in the cabin and looked at her with the expression, the focused, settled expression of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finished thinking, that Cora recognized as Hannah's version of a look she had seen on all 10 of their faces at different moments. A look she had put there without trying to put it there, simply by being in proximity to them for long enough. "I've been writing to Ruth," she said. "I know," said Cora. "She wants to come back." "I know that too." "Not just to come back. She wants—" "I know what she wants," said Cora. Not cold, just exact. The voice of a woman who has been thinking about the same thing for 19 years and has arrived at a position she will not be moved from quickly. The question is whether it's time. Hannah looked at her. Is it? The fire, the low sounds of the quarter settling into night outside the cabin walls. Tell me what you have, said Cora. Hannah told her. She was precise about it, precise the way Cora had taught her to be precise about things that mattered. She had been building for 3 years, in the way that things get built when you have no money and no official standing and no protection except intelligence and the people who share your purpose. She told her about the weapons: 4 rifles, 11 knives, 2 pistols. Acquired over 18 months through the network, through the contacts of the Hidden Five, Eli and Daniel and Miriam and Esther, who had spent years moving through the free and semi-free world outside the plantation, accumulating the things that the 5 inside could not. She told her about the routes. 3 of them, running north and northwest through the swamp country, mapped over 2 years by Isaac and Daniel, one visible, one hidden, who had walked every mile of them separately and then compared what they knew and built the complete picture from both halves. A map that existed in no written form, because a map that exists only in 10 people's heads cannot be found in a search. She told her about the timing, the specific gap in the patrol schedule that Samuel and Eli had identified after 2 years of careful observation, a 40-minute window during the change between the night watch and the morning watch, when the western fence was empty. 40 minutes was more than enough. She told her about the fire, where it would start, how it would move, what it would pull attention toward, and what it would pull it away from. And she told her about the room at the top of the main house, what the 10 of them intended to do there. Cora listened to all of it without interrupting. When Hannah finished, the cabin was quiet for a long time. Your brothers and sisters, Cora said. All of them. You've spoken to all of them? Yes. And they understand what this costs, what might happen. They understand. Tell me that Esther understands. She's the youngest. Hannah looked at her. She said to tell you she's been ready since she was 12 years old. Cora looked at her daughter, at the jaw that belonged to a man she had stopped grieving a decade ago, and the eyes that belonged to nobody but Hannah herself, that had been present and specific from the moment Della first held her in the lamplight of the birthing cabin and said her name. When? Said Cora. Spring. After the planting, when the nights are warm and the swamps are low. Cora nodded once. That was the end of the conversation, and the beginning of everything else. Gerald Pruitt began to suspect something in the winter of 1857. He was not a stupid man. This mattered to the story. He was not the unthinking brute of abolitionist pamphlets. He had read those pamphlets, dismissed them as polemic, and gone back to his ledgers. He was methodical. He was observant in the way that men who have built something are observant about what they've built. Not out of curiosity, but out of the practical necessity of a man whose livelihood depends on what he notices. He was 51 years old. He had run the Pruitt plantation for 26 years, since his father's death. He knew the names and histories of the 112 people on his property the way a banker knows his accounts, not personally, but accurately, with the knowledge that comes from sustained administrative attention. The suspicion began with the mathematics. Specifically, a January afternoon, the annual accounting, the entry for Cora, field hand, acquired 1845, 5 children, and something in that entry that snagged on a corner of his mind he couldn't immediately locate. He put down the ledger. He picked it up again. 5 children in 14 years. Not unusual for a healthy woman, but 5 pregnancies in 14 years, each one producing a single child. This was, now that he was thinking about it directly, below what his experience suggested was typical. A woman of Cora's apparent health and age over 14 years should have carried more pregnancies than 5. unless some had been lost early, which the records would not necessarily show, or unless some had been more productive than the records showed. He sat with that thought. Then he put the ledger away and went to dinner and did not think about it again for 3 weeks. The second time it came to him, it came with more weight. He was watching the north field, Hannah and Samuel and Isaac moving through the rows in the morning, and he noticed something he could not immediately name, something about the way they worked together. Not the ordinary coordination of people who have been in the same fields for years, but something more specific, something that looked, the longer he watched, less like habit and more like communication, like people who shared a language they were using in front of him without his knowledge. He watched for a long time. He went home. He thought about Cora's pregnancies, about the size of her last 2. He had noticed it at the time, filed it as unremarkable, moved on. About a conversation 3 years ago with a neighboring planter who had mentioned a midwife named Della, a woman who had been moving between the properties in this parish for more than 20 years. He thought about what a midwife could conceal, if concealment was her intention. He called his overseer. The overseer's name was Marsh, lean, long-faced, 40-something, 11 years on the property. The specific type of man who had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things while retaining the capacity for thoroughness when thoroughness was called for. He listened to Pruitt with the careful attention of a man taking notes. "You think the woman has more children than the ledger shows?" "I think it's possible." "How many more?" "That's what I want to know." Marsh thought about this in the deliberate, unhurried way he thought about things. "If she does, they'd be off the property, placed somewhere. She'd have needed help." "The midwife?" "Yes. And if they're off the property, they're outside your authority. They'd be under whoever took them in." He paused. "Finding them is the less urgent problem." Pruitt looked at him. "The more urgent problem," said Marsh, "is what they've been doing with the time." Outside the office window, the January fields lay flat and still and entirely legible, the way fields in winter always looked entirely legible. Stripped down, stripped bare. Nothing hidden, everything accounted for. "Bring her in," said Pruitt. They brought Cora in on a Friday. She walked from the field to the main house between 2 men, and neither of them touched her. She had not given them a reason to touch her. She had known since Hannah's conversation in November that this was coming, and she had prepared herself for it the way she prepared herself for everything, by deciding in advance what she would and would not do, and then making herself into someone for whom the things she had decided not to do were genuinely not possible. She would not tell them anything. This was not a decision she had arrived at quickly. She had sat with it through January and February, turning it over, testing it, asking herself in the honest way she asked herself things whether she was actually capable of it, or whether it was the kind of resolution that feels absolute in the calm and dissolves in the reality. She had been honest with herself about the difference between those 2 things for her entire life. She had decided she was capable. She walked into the main house. Pruitt received her in the study, a book-lined room smelling of tobacco and paper and the specific dusty authority of a place where decisions had been made for a long time. He was behind his desk. Marsh stood to his right. 2 men she didn't recognize stood near the door. She stood in the center of the room and fixed her gaze on the middle distance between Pruitt's face and the wall behind him. The specific, disciplined look of someone who is present without being present. "You have 5 children," Pruitt said. "Yes, sir." 5 pregnancies, all single births. She did not answer immediately. She was calculating, not hesitating, calculating how a woman telling the truth would respond to this, whether a pause was part of that response.
Yes, sir.
You carried large, he said. His voice was still calm, the voice of a man who was still at the information-gathering stage. Your last 2 pregnancies especially, larger than a woman with 1 child generally carries. Cora looked at the middle distance.
I don't know what you mean, sir.
The calmness left his voice. He nodded to Marsh. What happened in that room over the next 2 hours, Cora had prepared herself for, methodically, specifically, with the cold, patient attention she gave to everything that required surviving. She had told herself, they will hurt you. She had told herself, pain ends. The question is not whether you can endure pain. The question is whether, when you are inside it, you can remember that it ends, that what is on the other side of the ending is worth more than stopping the pain now. She remembered. She said nothing. Not one word, not one name, not one parish, not one direction, not one sound that could be read as indication. When Marsh told Pruitt she didn't know anything, Pruitt said she knew everything. They put her in the storage room off the main house, small, windowless, smelling of turpentine and old sacking, and told her she would stay there until she was ready to speak. She sat in the dark. She thought about her children. Not about the pain. She had put the pain in the place where she put things that were finished. She thought about Hannah's face in the lamplight in November. About the expression, focused, settled, arrived, that was Hannah's version of the expression all 10 of them made when they had decided something. She had seen it on every one of their faces at different moments and had recognized it each time as something she had put there. Not as a lesson, not deliberately. As a transmission, the way certain things pass between a mother and her children through the simple fact of sustained proximity to someone who carries a thing in their bones. She had carried it. They had received it. She sat in the dark and waited. On the second day, Pruitt locked the 5 visible children in the tobacco shed. He told Hannah and Samuel and Isaac and Grace and Thomas that their mother was being held and that they would remain in the shed until she provided information. He had decided that leverage was the more efficient approach. He had expected immediate results. He did not understand the architecture of what he was dealing with. Hannah in the shed looked at her 4 visible siblings in the dim light from the high window and said, in the quiet voice that was her mother's voice and something older than her mother's voice, "She won't tell him anything." "We know," said Samuel. "So we wait. We know that too." Grace was 17. She sat with her back against the shed wall and her arms folded across her chest and looked at nothing in particular. The expression of someone managing something internally that was not going to be visible externally. She had her mother's capacity for that. All 5 of them did. Thomas was 8 years old. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest and looked at Hannah with the expression of someone who is frightened and is working very hard at not showing it. "How long?" he said. "Not long," Hannah said. "Ruth knows we're here. All of them know. They've been watching since it started." "How do you know?" Hannah looked at him. "Because that's what we planned," she said. "And we planned it for a long time." Thomas looked at the strip of sky through the high window. March sky, pale, moving toward evening, perfectly indifferent. He nodded slowly, then differently, with the specific settling quality of someone who has found the ground beneath them. "She won't break," he said. It was not a question. "No," said Hannah. "So neither do we." "No," said Hannah. "Neither do we." They waited. On the 3rd night, Cora heard the quality of the silence outside the storage room change. Not immediately. The first hours of the night had been ordinary. The sounds she knew, Night birds, the creek, the distant stable. But sometime past midnight, the silence became a different kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence of people moving through the dark who have been training for this kind of movement for a long time. She pressed her ear to the door. 3 knocks on the wall to her left. Pause. 1 more. She closed her eyes. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. They had come. They had always been coming. On the other side of the wall, in the dark outside the storage room, Ruth stood with her hand still raised from the knock and listened for her mother's breathing through the wood. She had been 12 miles away for 19 years. She had been here, in her mind, for almost as long. She had her mother's eyes and her sister's face, and the specific quality, visible even in the dark, visible in the way she held herself while she waited, of someone who has understood for a long time exactly what this night was for, and has been ready for it since before she was told it was coming. Behind her, in the dark of the Pruitt plantation grounds, her brothers and sisters moved. The fire started at the north end. What happened on the night of March 14, 1865, was recorded in the parish register as a rebellion, one of dozens across Louisiana in the war's final months, when the institution was fracturing along every seam at once, and men like Gerald Pruitt found themselves holding something that had never been as solid as they believed. 14 dead. The main house burned to its foundation. 47 escaped northward. The register recorded the plantation's name and the owner's name. It did not record Cora's name. It did not record what happened in the bedroom at the top of the main house in the few minutes between the moment Gerald Pruitt reached for a pistol that was not there and the moment he understood, finally and completely, what had been living inside his property for 19 years. 10 faces in the firelight, not 5, 10. The same face 10 times, wearing the particular expression of people who have been patient for a very long time and are no longer required to be. He opened his mouth. "You don't know us," Hannah said. He didn't. He had known 5 of them by their ledger names and their working faces. He had known them the way he knew everything on his property, from the outside, from above, from the position of a man who believed that ownership produced understanding. It didn't. It never had. Understanding was built in the dark, in small hours, in a cabin where a woman scratched letters in a dirt floor with a pointed stick and covered them with her foot when she heard footsteps. It was built in the 19 years of a midwife's network, favors owed, debts held, the careful movement of children between properties and the careful movement of a Sunday afternoon. It was built in the letters that Hannah and Ruth had written to each other for years through channels that left no trace, in the routes that Isaac and Daniel had walked separately and combined in memory, in the gap in the patrol schedule that Samuel and Eli had spent 2 years identifying, in the weapons that the 5 hidden children had spent 18 months accumulating in a world where the 5 visible children had spent the same 18 months being visibly, accountably, undeniably present in the fields. While one was here, the other was elsewhere. Here was visible, elsewhere was invisible, and no one had thought to ask whether the same face could occupy both places. Gerald Pruitt's ledger had 5 children in it. Cora had 10. He had never counted correctly. That was his mistake. His only mistake. The kind of mistake that, made once, does not get made twice. The 10 of them left before dawn. They moved north and northwest on the routes that Isaac and Daniel had built, through the swamp passages that were low enough and marched across on foot, through the tree lines and the creek beds and the old logging roads that appeared on no official survey because they had been made by people who made them for exactly this purpose. Cora walked between Hannah and Ruth. She had not stood between them since the night they were born. Hannah on one side, Ruth on the other. Two children arriving in the same dark within 40 minutes of each other in a cabin she would never see again. She looked at Hannah. She looked at Ruth. Hannah moved the way Cora moved, with the exact, unhurried precision of someone for whom the path ahead has been thought through completely. Ruth moved differently, with a quality that was lighter, more adaptive, the movement of someone who had grown up making decisions in real time rather than in advance. They were identical, and they were not. They were the same sentence with different emphases, and the difference was the history of 19 separate years. Cora looked at her other 8 children moving through the dark around her. Thomas, 8 years old, who had sat in the shed and said, "Neither do we," and meant it. Grace, 17, who had her mother's capacity for silence. Samuel, who had spent 2 years watching a patrol schedule with his twin 12 miles away, comparing notes through a system of messages that looked like nothing. Isaac and Daniel, who had walked every mile of these routes separately and built the complete map from 2 half-pictures. Miriam and Esther, who she had seen 5 times between them in 19 years, who she knew the way you know something you have grown and sent out and trusted to grow on its own, completely, without condition, from a distance that was not the same as not knowing. Eli, who had brought the rifles. Ruth, who had knocked 3 times on the wall of a storage room and waited for her mother's breathing on the other side. She knew all of them. Not the way the ledger knew things, not from the outside, not from above, not from the position of someone who believed that counting produced understanding. The way a woman knows what she has grown in her own body and given to the world. Completely. Without condition. Without the need for a record. They walked for 17 days. Not one person was lost. There is no official record of what happened to Cora after March 1865. The parish register lists her as escaped. No further notation. No record of recapture. No record of what name she used when she crossed into free territory, or where she settled, or what the 10 people who walked north with her built in the years after. The record simply stops. This was not an absence. It was a protection, a deliberate, chosen silence. The same silence that had protected what she built for 19 years, operating on the same principle, for the same purpose. What is not written cannot be confiscated. What lives only in the people who carry it cannot be entered into a ledger under a heading that transforms it into something owned. The last thing Della ever said about Cora, said years later to her sister on a night when enough time had passed that saying it aloud felt less like risk and more like something owed, was this: "She was the most patient person I ever knew. Not gentle, patient. Those aren't the same thing. She understood time in a way I've never seen in another person. She looked at those babies in my hands and she didn't think about next year. She didn't think about 5 years. She thought about what could be built in 19 years, inside a system that believed it had accounted for everything, by people that system had failed to count correctly. She thought, if no one counts them, no one can take them. If no one knows they're the same, no one can use one against the other. If I give them each other and give them knowledge and give them time. Time was the one thing on that property that nobody thought to own. She gave them time. And when the time was finished, they came home for her. All 10 of them. They came home for her, and they walked out together into the dark, and no ledger on earth has ever gotten the count right. and none of them ever will.